Welcome to the political economy of the environment. Today's episode is about externalities. In most introductory economics textbooks, externalities are a side issue. You go through all the discussion of how the economy works, and then off towards the end of the book, there may be a chapter that talks about these things called externalities, which are kind of almost like an afterthought. They're sort of, they're a little problem on the side, and we have to think about how to deal with that problem. But in fact, externalities are really very central to how real-world economies work. And externalities aren't small, they're often big. In fact, a lot that influences our well-being, for better and for worse, comes to you in the form of externalities rather than in the form of things that you buy or sell in the marketplace. Broadly, there are two kinds of externalities. There are good ones and there are bad ones. The bad ones are called external costs or negative externalities. They're costs that are generated by production or consumption activities that impact someone else, someone who wasn't party to the transaction between the producer and the consumer. So for example, pollution resulting from production or consumption is a negative externality, an external cost. There are also good ones, external benefits, also called positive externalities, benefits that are generated by production or consumption activities that impact third parties in good ways, in ways that are good for them, but aren't taken into account in the decisions of the producers and consumers. When I drive into the university every morning, I often pass beautiful flowers and plants that people put in their yards along the streets. And they're not putting those on to make my day better. They're putting them in their yards because they like them. There's a transaction they incurred with the person who sold them the plants. They put their labor into planting the plants, etc. And they didn't do it with regard to how it would make me feel, and yet seeing those things makes my life a little better. It's a positive externality. And if you think about it, a lot of the things that make your life feel good, that make us happy, are things we don't pay for. They're positive externalities. I'm going to focus in today, however, on the dark side, on the negative externalities. And to give you an example, let's think about the production of paper, an ordinary commodity that we use in our daily lives. What happens when you produce paper? Well, there are costs of production of the firm, and the amount that paper costs in the market depends on those costs. And as we'll talk about, the price in the market is based on supply and demand. But in addition to the costs of the firm in producing the paper, there are external costs, negative externalities. And these take the forms of air pollution, water pollution, and deforestation, because paper is often made by cutting down trees to make the pulp that makes the paper. And given all those negative costs, those negative externalities associated with the production of paper, we can ask ourselves, what's the efficient level of paper production? How much paper ought we to be producing? And how much should it cost? Well, what happens in the market is that the decisions about how much to produce and the results in terms of how much it costs are made on the basis of supply and demand. Demand, that downward sloping curve, is based on the marginal benefit, the extra benefit that people get from consuming 1 unit of paper. The first units of paper are worth a lot, people are willing to pay a lot for them, but as you consume more and more of it, an extra amount of paper begins to be worth less and less. That's why the demand curve typically slopes down. And on the supply side, the cost of producing paper rises. For example, maybe as you produce more and more paper, you have to go further and further afield to get the wood, the pulp, to be made into paper. So that increases the transportation costs and the cost of production to the firm. And what happens in the market is that the so-called efficient level of production is reached where those curves cross. Beyond that point, the cost to the producer of making the paper would exceed the value to consumers, and so people aren't willing to buy it, and so you don't produce more. And the price is established in the market in exactly the same way. Now, what if there are these external costs, these negative externalities, these costs to society that aren't part of the costs that go into the decision-making of the firm? These external costs, if they were included, if they were internalized into our decision making, would push that supply curve up. They'd be added to the costs that are internal to the firm. And the efficient level of production would again be based on where that supply curve, taking into account all the costs, not just the internal costs, crosses the benefit curve, the demand curve that tells you how much society benefits from paper. And so you'd have a new efficient level of production that takes into account the external costs as well as the internal costs to the firm. And the result would be you wouldn't produce quite as much paper and the price of paper would be higher. And that efficient level, taking into account all the costs, the external costs as well as the internal costs, becomes the basis for environmental policies that seek to arrive at the efficient level of production, in this case of paper, taking into account impacts on society as a whole, not just on the firm. What kinds of policies do governments use to try to move us towards that more efficient goal? The goal could, of course, be established on the basis of other criteria as well, like safety or sustainability or justice, but for the moment, imagine it's based on efficiency. What kinds of policies could be used to get us there? Conventionally, the most common sort of policies are regulations, mandating certain kinds of technologies, like the installation of scrubbers in the smokestacks of factories, emission standards on how much pollution a firm can emit into the environment. Incentive-based policies are another important part of the toolkit. These came along really in the 80s and 90s. They became part of the policy mix here in the United States. These include things like pollution taxes and cap and permit systems that establish a price on pollution and let the firm decide how much to pollute. The idea being that if they have to pay for it, you're internalizing the cost, at least to some extent, and they're going to pollute less. Another policy tool is right-to-know legislation that compels polluters to disclose what they're putting in the environment and where, and therefore ensures the public's right to know about the quality of the air they breathe, the water they drink, and so on. An example of that in the US would be the Toxics Release Inventory that was established in the late 1980s that requires big industrial facilities to disclose information on the toxic chemicals that they release into our air and water and land. Now, the aim of those policies is to try to correct some of those externalities, to try to take account of those negative costs, external costs that aren't taken into account by private producers operating on the basis of the costs they themselves bear, but nevertheless that are important from the standpoint of our well-being, of the society's well-being. And to do that, and to recommend what the target should be for correcting the externalities, what economists have to do is come up with some way of valuing the externalities. They have to put a price on those external costs, on things like pollution. And how they do it turns out to be a rather complicated and in some respects often contentious exercise. And to give you a sense of one of the key issues in valuing these externalities, I want to ask you a simple question, a question that is really a metaphor for the larger issue that we're considering here, which is, what is the value of your right eye? Imagine that I'm a mad scientist, and I want to take your right eye and use it for one of my mad experiments. And I ask you the question, well, what's that right eye worth? Right? I could pose that question to you in two different ways. I could ask you, what would you pay me to avoid losing your right eye? What's your right eye worth to you? Say you've got a few days to come up with the money. You go to your friends, you go to your family, you go to your bank account, you get what you can. You come to me and you say, here's what I'll pay to avoid losing my right eye. And then I'm going to decide, do I take it or not? That's one way to ask the question. What's your eye worth? It's based on your willingness to pay to protect your eye. Second way to pose the question would be to say, what do I have to pay you for your right eye? How much money would I have to come up with for you to part with it? Now, you might say, I won't part with it for any amount of money. That's a perfectly legitimate answer. Or you might say, well, I've got two, okay, enough money, I'll give you my right eye. Whatever you say, the chances are that the valuation you come up with when you're asked how much you would be willing to accept for your right eye is going to be different from the valuation you came up with when we asked how much you would be willing to pay for your right eye. And invariably, willingness to accept, if it diverges from willingness to pay, is going to diverge in a particular direction. What you're willing to pay is going to be less than what you would require as payment to you for accepting the loss of your right eye. And the reason, of course, is that your willingness to pay is constrained by your ability to pay. You can't say, no, I would pay an infinite amount to protect my right eye, because you don't have an infinite amount of money. How much you're going to pay is going to depend on your ability to pay. And that's going to vary, by the way, from person to person. Those with more money are going to have more valuable right eyes by that measure. Whereas willingness to accept isn't constrained by your ability to pay. And that's the main reason why willingness to accept based valuations are generally higher. The difference between these two, between willingness to pay and willingness to accept, is based on, if you think about it, what you might call an allocation of property rights. The willingness to pay question assumes that I have the right to take your eye, and you have to pay me not to take it. Your right eye, in a sense, belongs to me. The willingness to accept valuation starts from the assumption that it's your eye, it belongs to you, and if I want it, I have to pay you to take it, right? The difference between the two valuations is what economists sometimes call a wealth effect, arising from the fact that willingness to pay is constrained by ability to pay and willingness to accept isn't. It arises from the difference in wealth from the initial assignment of the property right to, in this metaphor, your right eye. There's also a responsibility effect that psychologists have noticed about how the question is posed. When I ask somebody how much they'd be willing to pay, for example, to protect an endangered species, they may think, well, all right, not only is that constrained by my ability to pay, but it's really on someone else to decide whether that species is going to go extinct or not. It's not me that's really making the decision. But if I ask you, how much are you willing to accept to allow a species to go extinct, it implies that it's kind of on you. It's your responsibility. You're going to sell out the existence of a species for some money. So that difference in assignment of responsibility, as well as in assignment of wealth or property rights, is one of the reasons why willingness to pay often is less than willingness to accept. So when we ask the question, what's the efficient level of paper production and the efficient level of the associated pollution, we've got to be thinking about underlying that notion of what's efficient. How do we value those external costs, air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, etc., associated with paper production? Do we value it on the basis of willingness to pay? Or do we instead value it on the basis of willingness to accept? If we value it on the basis of willingness to accept, how much would the paper company have to pay the public in order for the public to allow the company to pollute the air, pollute the water, deforest the landscape, etc.? You're going to get a higher valuation in general of those external costs. And therefore, the amount of pollution that you think is efficient is going to be lower than if you're basing that decision on a willingness to pay based valuation of the externalities. The moral of this story is that what's deemed efficient depends on whether polluters have the right to pollute or the public has the right to clean air and water. Thanks.